man, this is gonna be good.
Picture, if you will, a 5-year-old me coming down from his room upon hearing some music. I walk into the living room and see my older sister watching something. I ask what it is. She says it's Superman. I sit down next to her and watch in fascination as General Zod is imprisoned in the Phantom Zone, being flung into space as he screams.
You will not down before me, Jor-El! Both you and them one day, Jor-El! Jor-El!
What followed was a defining moment in my young obsession with Superman, seeing for the first time the hero I worshipped in my dad's old comics leap off the screen. Superman 2 is a film that is much loved in my family, with my dad once listing it next to Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight as rare examples of a sequel being better than the original film. I am wholeheartedly with him on this one, as until the day I saw Unbreakable, Superman 2 was my favorite superhero film of all time. And it still is one of my favorites of all time, and definitely my favorite Superman film, or favorite Superman property full stop. It just brings me so much joy to watch. And I've watched it so many times I've lost count. Doesn't mean it's a perfect movie or anything. In fact, it very much is not. The production of Superman 2 is of course infamous in movie history for somehow taking the particularly troubled production of the first movie and turning the drama up to 11. Richard Donner's original plan was to shoot all of Superman 2 at the same time as the first one, but he ended up violently behind schedule and the producers told him to stop working on Superman 2 and focus on finishing the first one, a choice that led to decisions like having the time travel ending planned for Superman 2 moved up to the first one. But then things continued to get worse once the original was released. Cinematographer Jeffrey Unsworth died. Issues involving Marlon Brando began to pop up, namely the entirely ridiculous amount of money he was asking for to be in the movie. Donner's relationship with producers Alexandra and Ilya Salkin disintegrated, and eventually he was replaced with Richard Lester in a move that remains controversial to this day. Now, many accuse Lester of needless buggering with this movie, and in some ways they're not totally wrong, which I will mention in due course. However, for the most part, I think it's quite unwarranted, and we need to look at this situation realistically. If Donner had stayed on production of Superman 2, I don't think the movie would have ended up looking too different from the theatrical cut we got. He already had to come up with a new ending, as his planned time travel ending was now moot, so something like the memory kiss could have happened. The difference in cinematography styles was inevitable given the passing of Unsworth, so I don't think Lester is entirely to blame for that. And for what it's worth, new DP Robert Paintner does a respectable job, but it is occasionally very obvious that it is someone doing their best to do a Jeffrey Unsworth impression. And I'm gonna get my ass kicked for saying this, but the theatrical cut of the Superman 2 is mostly a very well put together movie given the circumstances. Studio recuts of movies tend to end in disaster, something that has become violently obvious in the wake of the Whedon cut of Justice League, but Superman 2 mostly avoids falling into incoherent recut territory. In fact, the story is actually more complete in this cut of the film than it is in the Richard Donner cut. The reshoots, for the most part, don't really hurt the movie's quality, and on occasion actually add something to the film that I kind of love. And of course, the effects work continues to be stellar. When reshooting the film, Lester had access to all the effects that made the first film look so fantastic, and he actually used them to great effect when he needed to. Like, tell me the Paris opening set piece doesn't look great effects-wise, or at least on par with the first film. There are a couple of dodgy effect shots, such as this moment that will forever be dubbed in my mind as kind of fire, thank you CinemaSins for that, and this stupid gag involving Mount Rushmore. And there are a couple of other instances of really dodgy blue screen, but for the most part it's pretty consistent. However, there are cracks aplenty in this cut, the most infamous of which is the humor Lester insisted on injecting into the film. Now, most of it doesn't actually offend me much at all, and I honestly think most people are being way too melodramatic about the whole thing. I mean, Lex Luthor and his gang were consistently portrayed as almost comical in the first movie, so for the most part, I don't see much of a difference. That said, there are a couple of jokes in this movie that are very clearly Lesterisms, and they are the worst. I'm mostly thinking of the visual jokes that happened in the climactic fight scene where we get ice cream in faces and flying toupees when Zod and Ursa blow Metropolis. It's just kind of stupid, and the film would have been much better without it. The editing of this movie is also very up and down. Apparently, Student Baird was one of the many people who followed Donner when he was removed from the project, so the touch he brought to the first Superman movie is now nowhere to be seen here. Now, admittedly, editor John Victor Smith had a pretty tough assignment editing this movie together, given the copious reshoot staged by Lester just so he could get his directing credit, and for the most part, he does pretty well. As I may have mentioned earlier, this movie flows along really well, and that's due in no small part to Victor Smith's work. There's also some stellar work in the middle section of the movie, where it cuts back and forth from Clark and Lois at the fortress to Zod and his crew destroying East Houston, which was a perfect way of underlining that Clark was making a very big mistake turning his back on the world for the sake of Lois. However, there are some more baffling choices made in the cut. Some scenes end really abruptly, especially the closer to the end of the movie we get, and at times the footage chosen in the edit was just badly chosen. The worst offender in this is the scene where Zod returns to the destroyed Daily Planet. This scene is made up of healthy portions of both Donna's original shoots and Lester's reshoots, and it's most obvious here where the cracks are, as Lester uses a quite honestly terrible backdrop behind the destroyed windows. Like, if I were the editor, I would have gotten as much coverage of the wide shots from Donna's original shoot as possible, and then only use close-ups of the reshoots. I don't know, it just looks like a rush job to me, which is irritating to see in a movie I love with my whole heart. John Williams elected not to score this film, and as a result, Ken Thorne was brought in to do his best John Williams impression. And I'm gonna be honest, for the most part, he pulls it off. There are several moments in the score that are pretty great, from the more intense arrangement of General Zod's theme to the sad theme that plays over the Superman flying away from Lois's apartment. His new arrangement of the Superman march for the opening credits, however, might be a little hit or miss for some people. Personally, I really like it. It is different, being a lot more upbeat in places and having a bit more of a march band tone in parts, but I think it works perfectly for this movie and is honestly the version you'll catch me listening to more often than the original Williams version. Blasphemy, I know. All in all, Thorne does a pretty solid Williams impression for the first part, even if it is obvious that he isn't actually John Williams.
Shut up and sit down, you big bald fuck.
Marlon Brando is noticeably absent in this movie. However, the way I see it, Marlon Brando can get fucked! It's well known that Brando didn't give a damn when all of his scenes were filmed. Most of his scenes were allegedly shot with him reading off cue cards. And for this performance, he was paid a $3.7 million flat rate, plus nearly 12% of all box office revenue, which is an obscene amount of money for phoning it in for no more than 30 minutes worth of screen time. And that is what he shot for Superman and Superman 2 combined. The fact that he also got first billing in a movie he's only in for 20 minutes, the first Superman movie, also really bugs me. So when it came time to keep working on Superman 2, Brando decided to sue the Salkinds, claiming that he didn't get his full cut of the box office and got an additional $15 million out of that lawsuit, which is admittedly less than the $50 million he originally tried to get. At this point, the Salkinds were understandably fed up with this man, and it was decided that none of the footage shot for him would be used in Superman 2 at all. Drastic? Probably, but the effect it had on this movie is infinitely more interesting. To begin with, in all of the sequences in the fortress, Jor-El is replaced by Superman's mother, Lara, as played by Susanna York. This is a much derided choice, but wait for it, I don't mind it. I did a not insignificant amount of complaining in my first video about how Clark talking to his Kryptonian parents about everything diminishes a lot of important character work, and about how him being told how to be a superhero by his alien parents rather than his human parents makes him a lot less interesting. But Lara's function in this story actually almost makes the concept work for me. The idea that she keeps all the historical records in her databanks is a nice touch, I think, and her conversations with Clark do feel a lot more like a parent talking to their child to me. Also, if Jor-El is going to send a digital matrix of himself along with Kal-El, it stands to reason he'd send a digital Lara too, right? Otherwise, that would imply that Jor-El didn't think to allow Kal-El to get to know his birth mother too, which would give him an ego comparable to Marlon Brando's. And then there's the removal of the scene that explains how Clark got his powers back after nuking himself in the rays of the Red Sun molecule chamber, where Jor-El does the Uno reverse card on the process. As the film is presented in this theatrical cut, Clark finds Jor-El's green crystal in the fortress, and then the next time we see him, he's suited up and ready to go. And this is another factor of this movie that is much aligned, but again, I like it. It is in some ways a shame that we don't get to see the specifics of how he gets his powers back, but in terms of storytelling, I think that betraying that he has his powers back before the final battle would have robbed this movie of some tension. I mean, sure, we know as viewers he's not gonna stay powerless, but I remember when I first watched this as a kid, that cutaway to the White House from the crystal was far more tension building than anything that could have actually explained how Clark got his powers back. Not having all the answers at this moment in time makes Superman's re-entrance with the swelling fanfare and his "you care to step outside" so much more satisfying. To me, anyway. So once I learned that there was actually a scene filmed where it explains how he got his powers back, I didn't really miss its presence in the movie at all. By this point, Reeve had well settled into playing the dual identity of Clark Kent and Superman, and his performance continues to be fantastic in this movie. I've already raved lyrical about how much I love him in the role in my last video, but I will continue to say here that nobody has ever played Clark Kent quite like him, and I don't think anyone ever will. There are so many great little moments Reeve gives to the character, like him keeping up the clumsiness that makes Clark so endearing, this hilarious glare he gives Lois when she breaks character while they're undercover, and so many other little details. And when he's in the tights, he's as charming as ever. But what really really makes this movie is everything that comes once the two characters sort of meld when Lois discovers his secret. It's at this point that we get truly pure Clark Kent, and Reeve plays him as a mildly awkward but still well-meaning guy, which has always been what Clark has been in my mind under all the Superman bravado. I mentioned in the review for the first movie that Superman's character was all Reeve and very little writing, and it's in this movie the script decides to do some of the heavy lifting too. For a start, there's an interesting through line across the movie about Clark playing himself to be jealous of Superman, and I think it works really nicely. After all, realistically, someone like Clark would be a little bit jealous of Superman, both because of his powers and because Lois likes him so much. It provides a nice little twist to the working relationship that Clark and Lois have, especially when Lois picks up on it and tries to make Clark feel better about himself by explaining that he doesn't need to have superpowers to still be a really good guy. You know, it's just really good screenwriting. You know, now that I'm actively thinking about it, it could be pretty telling of how Clark sees himself, wishing he were actually more like the confident persona he puts on for Superman. You know what, let's not go too deep into that rabbit hole right now, much as I want to. Let's keep going. The whole Superman gives up his powers to be with Lois subplot is actually pretty welcome, as in terms of writing, it actually begins to give Superman's character a little bit of depth. He's no longer just the Boy Scout who saves the world just because. He actually has flaws, which is his willingness to jump into the molecule chamber just to be with Lois with no thought for the consequences. And the moment when he gives up his powers is great at demonstrating this. Lara warns him over and over that he is in no way ready for what he's about to do to live with a mortal, but Clark doesn't care. He's blinded by the love he has for Lois and will do anything to be with her. It is a truly human decision, and the writing following his power loss actually works really nicely, allowing him to believe for 10 minutes that this was a good idea before coming face to face with every reason why it was a terrible idea. It's cleverly done that it starts with small things, like Clark complaining about a stiff back after a long car ride, and then moves on to larger things like when he challenges Rocky, forgetting that he has no context for what a fight would look like when he can actually get hurt. So when he gets the shit kicked out of him, it hurts to watch, not just because it's horrible watching our hero getting thrown around like that, but because we know as viewers, he's never really felt pain like this before, and because of that, it is overwhelming him. The writing doesn't hit us over the head with that point either. The most Clark verbalizes about it is a comment about how he'd never seen his own blood before, and the pained cries he makes while lying in the glass he's been pushed into. And the moment that immediately follows this, where we see Zod has taken the White House while he's still recovering from being beaten and humiliated, it is a sobering one. And Reeve plays the mix of sadness at watching a life with Lois evaporate in front of him and the determination to make things right perfectly. The aftermath is also written really well, as he realizes he can't leave Lois with the burden of knowing who he is and takes the knowledge away from her so she can at least be happy. All in all, I think Superman is written the best in the whole series here, and for the most part, it's downhill from here.
I will find him!
Far more iconic than any other villain in this movie series, let's face it, Lex Luthor is pretty goofy, is Terrence Stamp's performance as General Zod. Does Stamp occasionally ham it up in the role? Definitely. But for the most part, Stamp's performance is nothing short of iconic, bringing the Kryptonian villain to life with such energy and class. Of course, his more excitable moments are probably the most well-remembered ones, such as
Come to me, son of Jor-El! Kneel before Zod!
But some of his more memorable moments, for me at least, is when Stamp is playing him as calm and completely in control, as he feels so much more dangerous in these moments. The confrontation in the White House is a favorite of mine in this respect, as his voice is quiet, yet there's so much malice behind it. Also helps that the dialogue in this scene is written to perfection.
I see you are practiced in worshipping things that fly. Good.
I'll kneel before you if it will save lives.
It will. Starting with your own.
But there is one man here on Earth who will never kneel before you.
Who is this imbecile? Where is he?
This movie also does a really good job at making the evil Kryptonians look truly threatening. Right from their first major scene on the moon, they are shown to be brutal and callous, dispatching the astronauts there with ease. And some of these kills are really brutal. Even watching to this day, I cringe at Ursa ripping that guy's spacesuit open, letting him suffocate in the vacuum of space, and Non crushing that guy in the Artemis lander. Some of this scary violence is somewhat undercut by the moment where Zod lightly kicks this Russian guy and he starts floating, but everything else in this scene is super effective. It is an effective demonstration to the audience that yes, these guys are just as powerful as Superman, and they are a real threat to be worried about. The scene where they fight the US Army in East Houston is also brilliant in that respect, because of how little effort Zod and company exert in destroying the forces around them. The most effort any of them put into is probably from Non, who concentrates very hard on taking some rovers out with his heat vision, and then looks really proud of himself when he does. But aside from that, they act as if what they're doing doesn't faze them at all. They catch rockets without blinking, stand in rocket fire with no hint of concern, and blow away helicopters blunders and bad special effects with relative ease. The complete one-sided nature of the battle makes Zod and the others look completely unstoppable, and therefore that much more intimidating. The same applies to the scene where they use their super breath in Metropolis towards the end of the movie, but that is also somewhat undercut by factors I will mention later on. Once again, however, Zod is much like other Superman characters from these movies in that Stamp's performance is so good, you'd be forgiven for not noticing that there is basically nothing going on in terms of character here at all. Zod wants to take over the world. He wants to rule. That's basically it. However, he does have slightly more personality than some of the others. I like that he is ultimately bored once he has conquered Earth, and it's only the promise of revenge against the son of Jor-El that revitalizes him. It's a mildly interesting twist on the power-mad despot, and one I do like. It's just a shame that that's pretty much all the character he gets. However, the rest of his entourage have even less character. Sarah Douglas and Jack O'Halloran put in fun performances as Ursa and Non respectively, but they have even less going on character-wise than Zod, so it's really hard for me to make any comment about them aside from the fact that they're there and they get a couple of pretty neat moments each. I mean, I guess Ursa is evil, violent, and a little bit sexy, don't judge me. And Non is basically, he's stupid, cue the laugh track if the movie thinks it needs to pause for a quick chuckle. I mean, he's established in the first movie as Zod's mindless henchman, but I am left wondering how much of his silliness was Donner's doing or Lester's. There is another problem that plagues the Zod gang, and that is overdubbing. For reasons known only to Lester and possibly God, he felt the need to dub the villains over with new voice acting. Terrence Stamp's voice is altered to sound lower in tone. I'm pretty sure they pitched him down about a semitone.
You will bow down before me! Both you, and then one day, your heirs!
The closer we come to an atmosphere with only one sun, a yellow sun, the more our molecular density gives us unlimited powers.
And Sarah Douglas's voice is mixed with or replaced altogether with the uncredited voice of Annie Ross, who ended up playing Vera in Superman 3.
Strange. I tore those metal fibers like paper.
He was only a boy who will never become a man.
Why did they do this? I genuinely have no idea, because Stamp sounded plenty intimidating enough without the voice trickery in the first Superman movie, and Sarah Douglas sounds perfectly fine in the scenes I could find of her undubbed, which do happen to be mostly in the Donner cut or the extended TV cut. If there is anything that I would love, it would be to see a cut of this movie where all of this dubbing is taken away. Yes, the Donner cut does use some takes without the dubbing, but the switching between the two is arguably far more distracting, which I will talk about if I do a video about the Donner cut. Also, they have telekinesis in this movie for some reason, or force beams or whatever. Part of me wants to go with just, oh, it's a side effect of being in the Phantom Zone or something, but I think it's equally possible that Lester had just never read a comic book in his life. I'm back! Oh yeah, Lex Luthor is also in this movie, and his presence is odd. And I mean that in terms of how long he's on screen, because he appears 20 minutes into this movie, is shown doing his thing for a significant amount of time, and then vanishes from the movie for about 45 minutes until the movie needs him again, at which point he becomes a crucial part of the story an hour and a half into the film. So what exactly does Lex do in this movie?
Honestly, not much.
Well, to begin with anyway. The first bulk of his presence in the movie is to do with him getting out of jail so he can actually be a part of the movie later on, which he does with a box of tricks he built in prison with whatever he could find. His current hang-up is to find where Superman lives in an attempt to learn more about him so he can destroy him once and for all. Then, once he's escaped, he makes his way to the fortress using his Superman tracker and learns about Zod, at which point he realizes he has an opportunity to fall in line with 3 superpowered criminals. The movie then forgets about him for a while, but when he returns, he's seen trying to coax the Kryptonian villains to work with him. What I like about Luthor's presence in this movie is the fact that the film makes no bones about how in over his head he is. His ego blinds him to this fact, but he has absolutely no earthly idea what he's dealing with. This is best exemplified by the scene in which he first meets the trio. Throughout the scene, he is being constantly physically intimidated by Ursa and Non, with Zod issuing reminders to him of just how insignificant he is. At the beginning of the scene, Lex is standing in the door with the Zod squad sitting at the desk, but by the end of the scene, it's Zod standing in the door with Lex sitting with his feet up on the desk with a cigar in his mouth. It's a simple thing, but it's a great way of showing who's got all the chips in the scene. Except not quite, because when Lex enters the Oval Office in the beginning, he stands rather small in comparison to the Kryptonians, but when he has his feet up sitting in his own smugness, Zod still carries a level of menace with him. It's subtle, but it shows that Lex thinks he's bought the Kryptonians, unable to see past his own ego, whereas Zod has no intentions of indulging him and will kill him the moment it's convenient. Luthor truly believes he has the upper hand simply because he knows who the son of Jor-El is, and in the short term he's right, but in the long run he's sorely mistaken. He only continues to survive the film because he happens to be useful to Zod in the moment. The fact that Luthor remains almost entirely oblivious to this is really interesting character work. And as his screen time goes in this movie, I find that Luthor has been improved on from the first movie. Gone is the comical attitude taken to writing him. He's still witty and full of jokes, but he's not a punchline for most of his runtime like he seemed to be in the last one up until he revealed his missile plan. Perhaps this is because of the relative lack of Otis. I did a fair bit of griping about Otis in my last video, I think, but with him out of the way, Luthor could actually be a decent character without being brought down by Otis's comedy hijinks. It also helps that there's a distinct lack of silly pantomime moments like when Luthor was dressed up as a redneck and a paramedic for the benefit of his plan in the first movie. Speaking of his henchmen, the most puzzling thing to me about Luthor in this movie is the presence of Miss Tessmacher. She seems to be still working for him, despite, you know, his attempt on her mother's life in the last movie, and if you watch the extended TV cut of the first movie, he also tried to feed her to his pets. So why on God's green earth would she still be working for the criminal genius? I mean, she's never seen or heard from again once she follows Luthor up to the Fortress of Solitude, which seems to happen just for the benefit of giving Lex someone to talk to on his way up there, so who knows what happens to her after that. But still, why is she still working for this guy? Money? Money, probably. Okay, so now we're at the point where I usually break down the movie point by point and go over what I think of it like that. This section on the script actually ran so much longer than I anticipated, so we'll actually be also splitting that up into its little subsections depending on where in the movie we are. Anyway, let's get into it. The film begins with a nice little space travel sequence that takes us back to the ice planet Krypton to watch Zod get put in the Phantom Zone. Except this time it's worse, and Zod breaks a red crystal that does... Yeah, what does this stupid thing do? Also, that is quite an appalling piece of blue screen. The removal of Marlon Brando was also most felt in this scene, with him being replaced by some off-screen voice actor. I mean, yeah, they were a bit screwed in that respect from the word go, but could they have found a better voice actor than this?
You three criminals have been caught in a further act of seditious treason.
So Zod and the gang get put in the 70s rock album cover again, and they're flung into space. Zod's "You Will Bow Down Before Me" speech from the first movie is moved to this shot, which might be an annoying piece of revisionism to some, but I actually like it here on a movie-making level. Zod screaming his speech leading right into the opening credit is a pretty powerful piece of filmmaking. We didn't get 5 minutes of opening credits again, but this recap of the first movie that plays alongside the credits is actually kind of exciting, and was for the longest time all of the first Superman movie I'd ever seen. After that, we cut to this shot of the Daily Planet that definitely wasn't at all lifted from the first movie, and we get into our opening set piece, the Paris opening. And this seems to be an unpopular opinion, but I freaking love this opening scene. It doesn't have much to do with the movie, granted, but it gets the Phantom Zone busted open, and we get to see some nice Superman action, so I'm absolutely here for it. It's also just fun. I like fun things. We learn from Perry White that terrorists have stormed the Eiffel Tower for the old-fashioned no good reason, and Clark is immediately off to save the day. We then cut to Paris, where Lois is arriving on the scene to get an up-and-close and personal report on the terrorists and the hydrogen bomb they're threatening to blow up Paris with. A scene marred only by Lois's appalling French.
Oh, mercy, mercy, madam, mercy.
I don't know whether Lester told her to deliver it like this for comedy points or whether this was Kidder's idea, but either way, it's aggravating. You'd think a reporter of Lois's caliber would have better French pronunciation than that. Anyway, Lois gets herself into the Eiffel Tower through silly nonsense, and before you know it, she's holding onto the bottom of a lift to get her scoop on the terrorists, which is pretty classic Lois Lane, so I do appreciate it. Meanwhile, the police deduce that the H-bomb is in one of the lifts, so they decide to cut the wires to drop the lift to ground level so they can grab the bomb and save the city without giving in to the terrorists' demands. What could possibly go wrong there? They cut the wires and the lift drops, taking Lois with it and accidentally starting the bomb's detonation sequence. This whole sequence of the lift falling is actually really tense and remains one of my favorite moments in a Superman movie ever. The whole moment is just perfection from start to finish, from the tense editing of the falling lift to this shot of Superman flying to the rescue, to Superman stopping the lift and giving us a classic Superman one-liner.
I believe this is your floor.
Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular.
Try making something that exciting, Snyder. Superman rescues Lois and then throws the lift with the bomb into space, where it explodes and frees the 3 Kryptonian criminals. Zod and the gang are then free for all about 3 seconds before they figure out how to fly, and they set their sights on the moon.
What the fuck is going on?
We return to Metropolis in time to see Clark get hit by a car, which is one of the more blatant Lesterisms in this movie.
Break.
How does no one here even consider that he's Superman? And then we get a little moment in Lois's office between her and Clark that I really like. Seeing them operate more as friends than Lois telling Clark what to do all the time is a lot better, and it makes Lois a lot more likable as a character. We also get the detail that Lois is minding her health and drinking a lot of orange juice, which is a somewhat strange addition and one I imagine was added because Lester thought it would get a chuckle. It does succeed on that front, I must admit. Lois talking about getting into perfect health with a cigarette hanging out of her mouth is just so violently 80s, I smile every time I see it. Now it's off to jail, where we get Lex, this time with a slightly better bald cap, and Otis doing laundry while planning to track down Superman. On the whole, it's pretty unremarkable stuff, but we do learn from this scene that Lex listens to Liberace, which is for some reason hilarious to me.
I want my Liberace record back tonight.
We now move to the moon, where we learn that in the universe of the Superman movies, the Cold War isn't a thing, I guess, because a joint American-Russian mission is currently on the moon. However, they won't be for much longer because Zod and his gang happen upon the astronauts and introduce themselves by brutally murdering them. Nothing like a little casual murder of incidental characters to set the mood, eh? Zod and the others then quickly deduce why they have superpowers, and it is a very quick deduction, and come to the conclusion that the people they just killed for the fun of it came from Earth, which due to a misunderstanding they will refer to as Houston for half of this movie. Man, the screenwriters really couldn't help themselves with the villains being a little goofy, could they? Also, one might find themselves asking how they can talk in the vacuum of space, and I will respond with a who cares, it's a Superman movie. Anyway, we return to Lex's prison as he escapes, and we learn that Lex's plan to escape involved Miss Taskmaster bringing a hot air balloon over the prison and hoping to God the guards wouldn't be fucked to do their job properly. Stop watching the football match, you dicks. Anyway, Lex manages to get onto the balloon, but Otis is dumb and he sucks, so he gets left behind to take the rap for the escape, while the guards just stand and fucking watch the balloon float away. How are none of these assholes trying to shoot it right now? Wouldn't that be the first thought to go through their heads? Shoot the giant floating target? Dumbasses. Anyway, we need to keep moving, so we find ourselves in Niagara Falls as Clark and Lois go undercover in the worst hotel ever built to expose a honeymoon racket. God, this really is an ugly room, isn't it? It's like Lester turned to the production designer and said, build your worst fucking nightmare. Because if I had to stay in a room like that, I'd probably end up jumping into the flames of love or whatever the hell they called that fireplace. However, this scene is only really here to establish why they're in Niagara Falls, so we move on pretty quickly. So Clark and Lois take a stroll down Niagara Falls, where due to shitty parenting, a kid decides to play silly buggers on the rail and falls off. Everyone panics, but lo and behold, Superman swoops in to save the day in what is still a really exciting moment. I mean, how can you not want to cheer at Superman effortlessly flying in, saving a kid's life, and then cracking a silly joke before flying off again?
Again!
No, I'm sorry. Only one ride to a customer.
God, he's such a dork. As a general note, I also really love the background chatter in this scene.
What a nice man! Of course he's Jewish.
So Superman flies off, leaving Lois behind to finally put the pieces together in her head as to who Superman is. And I really like how this plays out. In the first movie, you see her have the thought and then dismiss it as the dumbest idea she's ever had. Before the kid falls, she cleans Clark's glasses, notices a vague similarity between him and Superman, and then once again shrugs off because again, it's a very silly idea. But when Clark is conveniently not there to see Superman for the nth time, it all begins to be too much to totally dismiss. I am also honestly sick of people memeing on Lois for not putting it together earlier. I mean, think about it. If there was a superhero running around with boundless power and charisma, would you instantly suspect your clumsy dork of a coworker just because there's a bit of a resemblance? Come on, guys. It is now time to check on Lex, who is used his Superman tracker to get to the Fortress of Solitude, which he gets into with absolutely no trouble at all. Jeez, Superman, not even so much as a locked front door.
Okay.
Once inside, Lex looks around and expertly deduces how to use the Kryptonian crystal technology in record time. I mean, he is the greatest criminal genius of our age, so I guess that tracks. And discovers the Kryptonian database that Kal-El brought with him to Earth, which helpfully explains the plot of the movie to Lex. Now, I mentioned earlier that I like Lara's presence in this movie, but what I didn't mention is that she seems to have imported Marlon Brando's pronunciation of Krypton into this movie.
As keeper of the archives of Krypton.
But let's put a pin in that because Lois is about to do something very stupid. Jump into a river that leads to Niagara Falls to try and prove that Clark is Superman. This is also a favorite scene of mine because there's a lot going on here to love. For starts, despite the aforementioned stupidity, I can't help but admire Lois's commitment to a theory. Like, she's so absolutely sure that Clark is Superman, she's willing to jump into a river to prove it. I can't help but be impressed by her convictions. And then of course there's the way the scene plays out. Once Lois does jump in the river, Clark of course has to save her, but he doesn't want her to know who he is, so he has to do it without giving himself away. This added level of stakes does make the scene just that little bit more tense, but it's also fun to watch as Clark solves the problem without removing his glasses, literally. Also, Reeves acting in the scene again. Yes, you've heard me go on about Reeves in these movies, and you'll hear it again, because watching him switch effortlessly from the panicked Clark who just watched his friend jump in a river to all business Clark calculating how to save his friend, it's a good performance, alright? I'd like to see Henry Cavill do this shit. So with the help of his heat vision and a mildly large stick, Clark saves Lois's life, and then falls into the water himself to cinch the deal in Lois's mind. He is not Superman, so in other words, Superman just gaslit Lois Lane.
Gaslighting doesn't exist, you made it up because you're fucking crazy.
I'm gonna blow up the city.
Zod and the squad land in a little lake somewhere in the middle of America in a scene that provides a couple of fun little things, like Zod being initially puzzled by the surface of a lake, which makes sense, Krypton was an entirely ice planet, so bodies of liquid water would seem a little odd to him, and a moment where we see a completely realistic reaction from Ursa to realizing she can literally burn people to death with her eyes.
Did you see that? Did you see what I did? I have powers beyond reason here.
The only real issue with this scene is that she seems to feel the snakebite. Quick question, how? She's a Kryptonian under a yellow sun, and by the rules set by this movie, they instantaneously are powered up just by proximity to the yellow sun. Why would she feel a snakebite through her invulnerable skin? Oh, and because the movie needs to stop for a quick chuckle, we get to watch Non fail at heat vision for a couple of seconds. We return to the hotel where Clark and Lois are drying off, and after all the effort in hiding his secret identity in the previous scene, Clark gives himself away by tripping on a fucking pink bear and falling into a fire. Is this a little silly? Well, maybe not so much as everyone thinks. I mean, the trip itself, I thought was supposed to be him doing his I'm Clark Kent and I'm very clumsy thing, but falling into the fire might have been a genuine accident. Or maybe it is the bullshit that Lois suggests in a minute that he unconsciously wanted her to know, so he gave it away as organically as he could. Either way, his hand ends up in a fire and comes out unscathed, proving Lois right. And while the setup is a little bit silly, the writing of Clark's reaction to this is pretty great. Watching him try to cover before realizing, no, he can't bluff his way out of this one, is a really great moment, and Reeve sells it perfectly before storming off shot and doing that wonderful thing he does where he changes characters in shot. I don't get sick of that. I really don't. So with the ruse dead, Clark decides to take Lois to the fortress, but first we have to check in with Zod, who's taken to harassing police officers in the middle of nowhere. Now, fun as this scene is, it raises a lot more questions than it answers. Like, it begins with Zod and the squad standing in the middle of the road for absolutely no reason, and then telling the sheriff from Live and Let Die to make way. Make way? Buddy, you can fly. What the hell do you need him to make way for? And then the scene just kind of ends. But the next time we see Zod, it seems like he just got bored of harassing these policemen and wandered into East Houston instead. In terms of narrative coherence, this scene is very weird, and realistically would have been far better off left on the cutting room floor. But these two idiots are also in the East Houston beatdown for a couple of minutes, so you can't really entirely lose it either. Lester, why did you do that? Oh yeah, and this scene also introduces Zod's force beams or telekinesis or whatever. The movie briefly shows us Clark and Lois arriving at the fortress, and then takes us to the little town of East Houston, Idaho, where Non is using his newly learned heat vision to harass chickens, and Zod and Ursa are curiously looking around a little diner, which is an amusing idea to me. Like, here are these supervillains, ruthless and cunning, except for Non, he's just ruthless, and they're looking around, just seeing what's up. Anyway, Ursa sees a couple of rednecks arm wrestling, and decides to use this as an opportunity to start shit. The rednecks don't take too kindly to this.
Girl or no girl, you're gonna spit teeth.
And the fight begins proper, with Zod throwing this man through some terrible blue screen out onto the street. Some idiot points a gun at Zod, so he kills him with his mind powers, I guess. And in most cuts of this movie, at this moment the film cuts back to Clark and Lois in the Fortress of Solitude. But in an extended TV cut of the film, this scene carries on for a bit longer, where the son of the dude who just got bodied by Zod's mind powers gets on a horse and rides away for help, only for Non to throw a police car light at him so hard he fucking dies. Not just dies, explodes. And as if that wasn't dark enough, it's followed by this exchange between Ursa and a civilian.
It was only a boy who will never become a man.
Jesus Christ, Ursa. You know, part of me wishes this scene had stayed in the movie because it would have made the Zod squad even more menacing and terrifying, but I imagine the scene might have crossed some good taste lines back in 1980, so I get why it was taken out. So after the Zod squad has demonstrated that they mean business, the news rolls in, at which point Zod finally learns that no, this planet is not called Houston, but right after that, the army rolls into town ready to shoot the shit out of the Krypton crew. This entire battle is really a lot of fun to watch. It's busy and filled with shit exploding, but never reaches the levels of obnoxiousness that other Superman films I could mention have. Well made stuff. At the same time as this is going on, Clark and Lois are having a lovely dinner, at the end of which they decide it would be a really good idea to sleep together. Clark then goes to Lara and says he wants to stay with Lois because he loves her, and then Lara informs him the only way this would be possible is if he gives up his powers and becomes an ordinary man. Clark doesn't even pause to think about it and jumps into the Red Sun molecule chamber and undergoes the power erasure process, a sequence that scared me shitless as a kid. However, when he emerges from the chamber, I always love that he emerges as Clark with the image of Superman fainting behind him. Does it make a lot of actual logical sense? No, but it's a really striking image and perfectly depicts Clark turning his back on Superman, so I don't really care that it technically doesn't make logical sense. It looks good. So now Clark is an ordinary person. What's the first thing he does? That's right, boys, he has sex. What a Chad. I'm keeping that in the video. I don't care. It's a terrible line, but I'm keeping it. You can't fucking stop me. At the same time, the Zod squad has moved on from East Houston and is rolling up on the White House, where a soldier battalion has tried to prepare for their arrival, but it's all in vain as they get the shit beaten out of them. Like, this dude takes Ursa's boot straight to the head. He's dead. He's so very dead. Hey, where do I sign up for that? Zod breaks down the Oval Office's door, and the scene with most of the best dialogue in this movie begins, where Zod brings the country to its knees, almost literally. And as mentioned earlier, Stamp is at his most intimidating as Zod in this scene. It's about this time that Clark gets the absolute shit beaten out of him in the diner, and I am once again going to praise the way this movie flows together. Delaying the moment that Clark finds out what's happened to Earth until not only after he's had his powers stripped of him, but to the moments right after he was beaten bloody for no real reason, makes it all the more impactful when he hears the name Zod, and it serves as this final kicker. He's messed up, and he needs to go back now. This scene is a little bit broken by a bit of obvious ADR. They had to dub over Clark's original line, he knew, to they knew, to fit the fact that Lara is in this movie instead of Jor-El.
They knew. I heard him.
But it's not the worst piece of ADR in this movie by any measure, so it's not so bad. So against all odds, Clark makes his way back to the fortress and walks into the quiet mausoleum that it is now. This scene is one that continues to move me to this day. Hearing Clark, my hero, struggle to tell his parents who can't even hear him that he failed, yeah, it gets me, especially with Reed's performance. It is interesting to note, however, that he spoke to his mother about erasing his powers, then turned to his father when he realized he'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. Maybe it was because Jor-El was the one he first spoke to when the fortress was built? I don't know. So Clark realizes nobody can hear him and feels hopeless. Then he sees the green crystal lying in the snow nearby, where Lois had left it after Clark had explained its backstory to her earlier. Set up and payoff. He crosses over to pick it up, and the crystal glows awesomely, and then it cuts away, and the next we see of Clark, he's Superman again.
Don't think about it!
It's about this point that the movie remembers that Lex Luthor's in it, and he strolls into the White House, breaking Zod and his gang out of their boredom for a moment, even if it is at the promise of killing some random human. This scene also establishes that Zod has ruled over the planet for a few days, which in turn implies that it took Clark a couple of days to get back to the fortress. All things considered, I think Clark makes some really good time on that. So Lex finally gets a shining moment in this movie where he informs Zod that the son of Jor-El is on Earth and offers him to Zod on a plate, for a small fee of course.
Australia.
This is another masterfully directed scene, even if that direction is a little undercut by the fact that part of the conversation has been very clearly cut out.
The son of Jor-El. The son of Jor-El. On this planet. Possibly you know him better by his nom de voyage.
It's time for our final battle!
So Lex says he wants Australia, and the movie cuts to a globe, specifically on Australia, before revealing itself to be in Perry White's office. That is such a clean transition. In White's office, the planet crew argue for a bit about Superman before the Zod squad comes kicking in the doors looking for Superman. Lex appears as well, and reveals he brought them to the planet to capture Lois Lane because he somehow knows what's going on between her and Superman? How? Did he watch the first movie? Did he somehow deduce that from the I Spent the Night with Superman article? Actually, that one would make more sense. Either way, this revelation prompts one of the most out-of-pocket exchanges in this movie.
What an undemanding male this Superman must be.
Yeah, and you could use the tuck here and there yourself.
All seems pretty bleak, but just at that moment with a gust of wind, Superman is there.
General? Would you care to step outside?
Yes! Yes!
Honestly, in terms of any superhero entrance in any movie ever, this is the top for me. Nothing else compares, this is peak cinema. So the major battle between Superman and the other Kryptonians begins, and this entire sequence is a mixed bag, really. Now, don't get me wrong, 90% of it is absolutely unequivocally great filmmaking. The other 10% of it belongs to Richard Lester. I'll start with all the great stuff, which is the characterization of those in the battle. From the moment the battle begins, Superman is shown to have two evenly handed priorities: take Zod down and keep the population safe. From the first moment Zod actually threatens violence against him with a piece of construction equipment, the first thing Superman does is to look around to see who could get hurt by it. When a tower is in danger of killing people, he stops the fight to make sure that doesn't happen. This is what sets Superman in these movies ahead of a lot of other movie superheroes for me. So many superhero movies these days seem completely unconcerned with collateral, especially a certain 2013 Superman film I could name. This movie not only acknowledges it, but respects the character of Superman enough to show him doing everything he can to keep the collateral at a minimum, or zero if at all possible. And then on the other side is Zod, whose scheming and complete disregard for human life dovetail perfectly into one another. He voices complete and utter confusion about how Superman can actually care for these people, only really getting it when Ursa compares the humans to pets, and then uses this knowledge as a battle tactic, leading to probably my favorite part of this fight, where Zod blows up a bunch of cars to draw Superman's attention, and is only stopped from killing further people when Superman reflects his own heat vision back at him. Yes, I am fully aware that this mirror should not have survived that heat vision, let alone actually actually reflected it, but again, who fucking cares? It's a Superman movie. From then on, the gang seem to try and go out of their way to keep Superman down on the ground, as there they can control him better, finally ending with them throwing a literal bus of civilians at him. So what's the downside of this fight scene? Lesterisms. Throughout the fight, Lester insists on cutting back to the crowd watching below. This on its own would be and should be a good thing, and actually provides some of my favorite little moments in the fight, like
Superman, kill him!
Man, this is gonna be good.
a lot of the time the cuts into just random people saying stupid shit like,
Wow, home run.
The big one's just as strong as Superman.
it succeeds in taking the stakes out of the fight a bit, which is ironic given that cutting down to the civilians should add stakes to the fight. And when they aren't making cheap one-liners, it does, such as when the tower is hurtling towards the streets, or the cries of anguish when Superman flies away at the end of the fight. So that makes the times they cut to some rando making a dumb joke all the more annoying. There is also an ass ton of product placement in this scene. Now on one hand, I understand you can't film a scene in a big city realistically without there being ads all over the place. This is why of these product placements, the JVC and the Coca-Cola ones bother me the least. But in the second half of the battle, there is a shocking prevalence of Marlboro and Kentucky Fried Chicken product placement. I don't know, man, it's really annoying. I'm quite convinced that all of the reshoots were paid for in these 5 minutes. It also feels really skeevy to me that a cigarette company got heavy product placement in a movie that was largely marketed at, you know, kids, especially in a Superman movie. That shit does not sit right with me. However, nothing best exemplifies the mixed bag that this fight is more than the bit with the Zod squad blow Metropolis. Everything begins perfectly well enough. I like the idea that the people of Metropolis's response to thinking Zod just killed Superman is,
Right, I'll do you for that.
I have to admire their resolve and their bravery. The actual scene itself should be some terrifying shit. I mean, the Kryptonians destroy an entire block of Metropolis without taking a single step. A lot of it is genuinely frightening, especially the shots of cars being effortlessly lifted up and thrown around. So what kills the tension in this scene? The Lester jokes. A lot of the cutaways to the citizens that should be them running / them being pushed away in fear are instead devoted to some really actually terrible jokes. Lester, oh buddy, oh pal, why did you do that? So Superman realizes that if he continues fighting anywhere near society, people are just going to keep getting hurt, so he does the smartest thing possible and hightails it out of there, leaving Zod to celebrate, believing that Superman is a coward, and leaving the people of Metropolis crying in desperation for him to come back. Yeah, that'll be a gut puncher. Zod and the crew return to the Daily Planet to gloat in a truly awesome Zod POV shot, and then brag about how Superman ran away and how they will kill him the next time, prompting the best exchange in this movie.
What do I get from my triple threat? Bow, yield, kneel. That kind of stuff closes out of town.
Why do you say this to me? When you know I will kill you for it.
Zod's just so confused. It's like he's sitting there thinking, is this motherfucker trying to die? But alas, Lex delays his death further by revealing he knows where Superman lives, and the Kryptonians fly off to the fortress for one final confrontation with Lex and Lois as collateral. They arrive in the fortress, and Zod's immediate first point of order is to roast the shit out of Superman's taste and design.
A sentimental replica of a planet long since vanished. No style at all.
I expect better manners from my guests, Zod.
Yeah, me too, Clark. The fuck? Zod's rude as hell, man. Non sees Superman and goes to attack him, and thus begins the battle in the fortress, which is much maligned by many fans in this movie. And once again, I'm going to defend it. Okay, look at it this way. When Superman came up to the fortress, it stands to reason that he'd prepare a trick or two to even the playing field, right? So this one trick Plasticine-esque could very well be something he whipped up for the occasion, as would be these holograms. I mean, we know the fortress has hologram emitters of some kind, so like, yeah, it works. It's not that bad, guys. And as for him vanishing and the holograms appearing, I was just read it more as him moving so fast the eye can no longer see him than actual teleportation. Same goes for when Zod and crew do this shit. The only point in the scene I'm still actively annoyed about would be Zod and the gang's force beams, but those have been an issue all movie, so I'm not going to start complaining about the mechanics now. So using the hologram, Superman manages to get one up on Zod, but Ursa and Non respond by threatening to rip Lois apart and then continue to hold her as leverage. Oh, and by the way, this whole time we've been occasionally cutting over to Lex, who is being played by an unconvincing double because Gene Hackman couldn't be convinced to come back to do the reshoots. So that's weird. Anyway, Superman pulls Lex aside and tells him to try and get the Kryptonians into the molecule chamber from earlier, but Lex immediately turns around and knocks on Superman to the others.
You poison
poisonous snake.
What's your profanity?
Superman is then forced back into the chamber and then brought out to swear loyalty to Zod. Once again, this is a really well-directed scene. Superman acts like he's in pain in the molecule chamber and looks drained when he steps out of it, so you would be forgiven for thinking that he has actually lost his powers again. But the movie gives you enough hints that something's not quite as it should be. Like this shot of Lex looking around thinking, hang on, what's going on? One might also be tipped off that the red lights are on outside the chamber, but you'd also be forgiven for thinking that was done for dramatic effect to make the scene look more sinister. I certainly did when I was 6 watching this for the first time. So when you get the moment where Superman reveals the gig is up, it truly is an exciting and satisfying moment. And the reveal is perfectly done. There's this wonderful silence that hangs over the fortress as Zod finally gets what he's wanted all this time, for Jor-El's heir to kneel before him, before it's broken by the sound of Zod's hand getting crushed. Slightly more brutal than Superman's usual MO? Definitely. But as a movie moment, so satisfying. Also, the fact that Clark knew Lex would betray him and used his duplicitous nature against him makes me smile every time. And then Superman kills the Zod Squad. Or did he? Even as a kid, I felt it was a little ambiguous as to whether they actually died, and I'd reasoned as a kid they'd been thrown into some sort of suspended animation. However, with the benefit of having extended footage at my fingertips, I can rest easy that no, Superman did not kill them. In a scene that was ultimately chopped from the movie, a sort of Arctic patrol arrives at the fortress, which then takes away not only the depowered Kryptonian criminals, but also Lex Luthor as well. But as it is in this cut, it does look like Superman killed them, which is irritating. Oh, and he just fucking leaves Lex in the fortress in this cut too.
Bruh.
So Clark and Lois return to Metropolis, and we meet up with him again at the Daily Planet, where Lois is a complete and utter mess. This scene is a real gut punch of reality for the viewers, as while we want Clark and Lois to end up together, we come to understand through the movie that it is just not possible. So seeing them try to come to terms with that is really heartbreaking. Even sadder is the fact that now Lois knows who Clark really is, and the burden of having to keep that to herself on top of the frustration of a relationship she and Clark both watch disappear in front of them is almost more than she can bear. So in the end, Clark decides it's better for both of them if she just didn't remember any of it. So he does the memory kiss. Yes, I am also about to defend the amnesia kiss. Why? Well, because it is a superpower that Superman has in at least one comic from the 60s, specifically Action Comics 306. So at least it wasn't a case of Lester pulling another superhero out of his ass like he did with Zod's force beams or whatever the fuck. And anyway, given the choice between the amnesia kiss where Lois just forgets and the original written ending where Superman erases the entire movie by flying back in time, I'll take the amnesia kiss. And oh boy, I will have words about the original ending if I ever write a video about the Donner card. So the reset button has been pressed for Clark and Lois goes back to her life as she knew it before discovering Superman's identity. Also, I love how one of the indicators that Lois is totally back to normal is that she wants
A hamburger at 9 a.m.
with a freshly squeezed orange juice. That's character consistency. I love it. So the movie is just about over, but we gotta go back to the diner from earlier so Rocky can get his just desserts.
Dude, that's funny. I've never seen garbage eat garbage before.
Now, if the scene of Superman one-upping Zod was satisfying, this scene is even more so. Seeing this asshole who enjoyed walking all over people getting taken down a peg by someone he put through a glass window would be immensely satisfying in any context, but when it's Clark Kent, our hero, serving out the justice, even better. And then Clark pays for the damages he just incurred and casually leaves. Even when he's teaching a bully a lesson he'll never forget, he's still a Boy Scout. Fucking love it. And yeah, that's about it. Just gotta stop for a bit of forced America patriotism and smile into the camera, and that's the end.
And another thing,
Clark throwing his hat onto the rack is funny, but it does undercut the clumsy Clark thing a bit.
Moi, journaliste américaine.
Jesus Christ, Lois, it's Je suis journaliste américain. You should know this, you're a journalist. Given the fact that these guys took the Eiffel Tower, there really is not a lot of hostages. This bunny is joke is silly nonsense and I hate it. Dude, these have to be the worst parents ever. Clark literally just caught this kid being a dumbass on these rails and the parents still didn't watch him properly. Do they want their kid to die?
Why didn't you go before we left?
That was 2 days ago.
Damn, how did you hold it in that long, Miss Tessmacher? Clark says in this scene that he enjoys being the doofy, clumsy Clark. It's kind of adorable, actually. Susanna York looks almost ethereal when she steps out of the crystal. I don't really have a comment about it, I just really like it.
Gee, I think perhaps somebody ought to teach you some manners, sir.
This Rocky guy is a real bastard for hitting Clark when he had his back turned. I fucking hate him. I just noticed now that you can see that the light that's supposed to be coming out of the crystal isn't actually coming from the crystal. But if I only just noticed it now, it's not really a big deal. How does Lois not break her hand on Ursa?
He's caged, Nom.
No, he has not.
No! Don't do it!
Could they not have done a retake of this? Reeves looked like he's smiling here. Also, the sheer fact that Superman was even winded by this bus.
Shut the fuck up!
Jesus, it's been a long video. My most sincere apologies for that. But at the end of the day, this is a film I really truly love, cracks and all. It is the foundation for a lot of what I love about superhero storytelling today, and is definitely a massive part of how I came to truly understand Superman as a character outside of the pages of my dad's old comic books. There are many flaws in this movie, mostly in the production due to how troubled that was. But ultimately, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that whole is still one of the most enjoyable superhero movies I've ever seen. Certainly the most enjoyable of the Superman movies, which tragically isn't against a whole lot of competition, granted, but I do fully stand by it. It's a bit of a shame about the sequel, isn't it?